Well, the world is watching Iran as tensions between the Islamic Republic and the United States ratchet
with
up.
Iran, we are learning new details about what may have led to increased tensions between
U.S. officials raise concerns of an Iranian attack.
Iran has been a threat for the past 40 years.
Credible intelligence about threats to American forces.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. Journalists and news junkies are taught to consider the source. One of the challenges in understanding the U.S.-Iran showdown is that the key sources are unnamed. An anti-Semitic video published by AJ Plus Arabic is pulled down. The network issues an apology and suspends 2 journalists. Julian Assange now faces more charges in the U.S. that have precedent-setting implications, alarming ones for mainstream news outlets. The perils that women journalists face in the age of the internet, and gimmicks galore, election coverage on Indian news channels.
And quadcopter up and away. Let's go. Chalte hain. Ooh.
Stop us if you've heard this one before. Anonymous sources in Washington quoted in the U.S. media over purported intelligence reports on specific but unspecified threats from a Middle Eastern country. And this, a buildup of U.S. military forces around said country, because, as the narrative goes, somehow maximum pressure, perhaps even war, is the best way to bring peace to the region. This would not be the first time the American media, wittingly or unwittingly, has made the case for war on the basis of vague, anonymously sourced intelligence. In 2003, it was Iraq. This time, it's Iran. Much of American news reporting on U.S.-Iran relations glosses over President Trump's role, how his policies have led to this standoff. There's even less space given to reflect on the history of American aggression against Iran, which is not to say that the Islamic Republic, ruled by authoritarians and involved in wars in Syria and Yemen, is an innocent player. However, inflammatory headlines, unnamed sources, and decades of misinformation in the U.S. media over Iran don't help. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C. Headlines like these about Iranian belligerents and new tensions with the U.S. came from sources like these. The official who declined to be identified. The 3 U.S. officials familiar with the findings. A defense official who spoke on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. It's a safe bet, though, that the official was authorized to speak anonymously. If we were to write a headline on the coverage of this story, it would read, "Anonymous government sources. U.S. news media risks being manipulated again."
All of a sudden, you have a news headline that takes over the world, which comes from a rather dubious and questionable sourcing. But by the time that people start asking questions, it's already too late because the narrative has been framed. One has to take into account that a single source story can potentially start a disastrous confrontation. And this really, I think, increases the burden of responsibility on journalists to make sure that they double-check and they triple-check their sourcing.
Media outlets relying on certain sources is not something peculiar or uncommon. On the contrary, it occurs worldwide, whether in the US or elsewhere. This is especially true when the matters relate to state security or intelligence, which always involves particular sources who can provide verification or information.
There was a Wall Street Journal report on the threat from Iran. What seemed very interesting is that the headline was almost the exact opposite of what the story was describing. Along the reporting, you would see points and information that would refute the actual conclusion that one would get from the headline. There's a good part of the audience that only sees the headlines on their phones, on the website, and then they move on to the next story.
Those headlines have been largely based on 2 things. A U.S. intelligence report that was first reported upon on May the 6th, and gunboat attacks against 4 oil tankers, 2 of them Saudi, that took place a few days later and have been blamed on Iran or its proxies. The intelligence report has not been made public. Its contents have reportedly been described to various news outlets by those anonymous officials who talk about specific but unspecified threats from Iran against American interests in the region, including U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. For media watchers, observers of American foreign policy, and victims of those policies, moving on is not an option because of memories of Iraq. Anonymous sources were an issue back then, too, as was dubious intelligence, vague claims of Iraqi WMDs.
He develops weapons of mass destruction
That the U.S. media swallowed far too readily and obediently.
If he gets weapons of mass destruction, Jerry, what does that mean? What does that mean for the world?
Iraq 2003 is considered the greatest collective failing in the history of American journalism. And it is far too soon to see those kinds of editorial practices in use once again.
The U.S. media was not critical at all of the George W. Bush administration in the lead up to the Iraq War, even though there were multiple sources outside of the U.S. government saying that there is no evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And in this instance, we are seeing the same sorts of attributions begin again when in the U.S. media they're talking a lot about threats from Iran, and yet they're not providing much intel about that.
We are now dealing with people in the Trump administration like John Bolton, who have a long track record of trying to politicize intelligence to advance their agenda.
Our goal should be regime change in Iran.
So the burden of responsibility is really on the shoulders of the journalists to go beyond the Trump administration and try to talk to U.S. allies in the region and the Iranians also to get their perspective.
In the news business, context matters, and it's largely missing in the U.S.-Iran coverage. For most Americans, this conflict goes back to 1979, the Islamic Revolution, and the subsequent hostage-taking of 52 Americans in Tehran, held captive in their embassy for 444 days. But it's what led to the 1979 hostage crisis that Iranians remember. 1953, and the U.S.-led coup that brought down the government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled the autocratic Shah of Iran, who would rule his people for a quarter century. But there's even more to U.S.-Iran history, such as the role that America played in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when the Reagan administration helped Saddam Hussein's forces and his army used chemical weapons. At least 100,000 Iranians were casualties of that. Despite that long, troubled backstory, in 2015, Iran came to an agreement with the US, the EU, and 5 other countries, in which it agreed to limit its national nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. The Iranians stuck to their end of the deal. The Trump administration did not, pulling out of the pact last year unilaterally. But U.S. news outlets that are usually not shy with their criticism of President Trump provide him with much more leeway on foreign policy than on domestic issues.
When it comes to domestic politics, especially under the Trump administration, the U.S. mainstream media has been quite good at trying to be critical of the administration and what it's doing.
Is the president's 2020 budget proposal dead on arrival? What is the political strategy behind this move?
But when it comes to foreign policy, traditionally U.S. mainstream media does not really push back and try to understand the bigger context of why are we even going to engage in something like this.
But a U.S. government official tells CBS News this category of weapon is routinely supplied by Iran to its proxies in Iraq.
Iran's policies in the region are often described as malign, nefarious, destabilizing, as if everybody else's actions in the region are benign and stabilizing. Look at what Saudi Arabia has done in Yemen in the past 4 years. Look at what the US did in the region by destabilizing Iraq. So I think this kind of demonizing Iran and portraying Iran as the source of all evil in the region is, by definition, a hype, and by definition results in misguided policies that could produce another tragedy like the Iraq War.
What nobody had to cover in 1953, 1979, or in 2003 with Iraq was an American commander-in-chief on Twitter, effectively negotiating with a major foreign state on a microblogging site. Donald Trump, not the most articulate president the U.S. has ever produced, can be remarkably clear and forceful on Twitter. However, diplomacy is not easily conducted when the players are limited to 280 characters or fewer.
From the very beginning, Trump has used Twitter as a tool in his campaign, but he now uses it to make statements that differ from his actual policies. When he threatened North Korea with fire and fury, he did so to restart negotiations. While the latest threats by Trump obviously make headlines as he's the US president, they are no longer conceived as shocking, so his strategy is no longer as effective.
Now, I know President Trump has used that on North Korea, and it has worked, and it seems like he's trying to use the same blueprint for Iran to eventually get them to the negotiating table like he did with Kim Jong-un. But the Iranian leadership thinks very differently than the North Koreans. They are not looking for a legitimacy photo op on the world stage with President Trump. They don't want to negotiate with him publicly. They've said it numerous times because they say he's been disrespecting them, and his Twitter is actually an important part of this entire disrespect campaign that the Iranians are talking about, if not the main pillar of it.
Donald Trump would not be the first occupant of the White House accused of using Iran as a useful distraction from domestic political troubles. In a stream of tweets in 2012 and 13, Americans were warned that Barack Obama was preparing to do the same thing, to start a war with Iran in order to get elected, to save face. All written by Donald J. Trump. That kind of context hasn't made it into the headlines, but it's a big part of the story. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Tarek Nafa. Tarek, the first story that we're looking at strikes close to home. It's about Al Jazeera, one of its digital online outlets, AJ Plus Arabic. Last week, it posted a story questioning the Holocaust. What did that story actually say?
Richard, first off, this video was both anti-Semitic and deeply offensive. 2 journalists involved have been suspended, and there's an ongoing investigation into it. But let me back up a little bit and give you some details on the video itself. It was produced by AJ Plus Arabic and put out with the caption that said, "What is the truth about the Holocaust and how did the Zionist movement benefit from it?" The report then claims that the killing of 6 million Jews was, quote, a narrative that was adopted by the Zionist movement. The video got hundreds of thousands of views before it was pulled down. And we wrote to Yasser Bisher, the executive director of Al Jazeera's digital division, and he sent us this statement. "We at Al Jazeera deeply regret the mistake and the offence caused by the content to individuals and communities across the world. I want to reiterate that Al Jazeera does not tolerate any such material on any of the network's platforms, and we are ensuring that additional processes are being put in place so that this type of error doesn't happen again."
But the reaction online was instant. It was already out there. Much of it came from within Al Jazeera itself, including AJ Plus, the English language version, did it not?
That's right. The video was widely criticised online. Some of the criticism has centred on just how different the content put out by the Arabic language service can be from the English language one. The head of the English language version of AJ Plus was categorical, tweeting, "I was personally shocked and appalled by a video on the Holocaust published last Friday by the editorially separate Arabic language AJ Plus. The video, since removed, was an unconscionable violation of our values."
Moving on to Julian Assange now. The U.S. Justice Department is charging the WikiLeaks founder, who had already been charged under one law, with another 17 counts of breaking a second law, the Espionage Act. That is disturbing, not just for Assange, who's looking at up to 175 years behind bars, but also has implications for other journalists. Tell us why.
Because of the precedent these latest charges would set. Assange was initially charged under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, since he'd helped his source, Chelsea Manning, get classified material out of Defense Department computers. At that stage, the Justice Department appeared to be trying to make a distinction between Assange and the rest of the media, including news outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian that partnered with WikiLeaks and published its material. Some of these new charges under the Espionage Act relate to how Assange encouraged his source to provide him with material, the kind of thing journalists do every day. But they also focus on WikiLeaks publishing classified documents, and that has implications for mainstream news outlets that then did the same. Remember, the difficulty in differentiating what WikiLeaks does from what news organisations do is what prevented the Obama administration from using the Espionage Act against Assange in the first place, which explains why the American Civil Liberties Union calls these latest charges an extraordinary escalation of the Trump administration's attacks on journalism.
Okay, thanks, Tarek. We're turning now to dispatches from what they call the virtual war zone, a story about the perils of online journalism. Reporters have always had to defend their work, and the trolling of journalists is now routine. But many female media professionals deal with the kind of hate messages men will never see. Comments about their gender, their appearance, and sexuality. The language can be ugly and violent. Threats of sexual assaults and rape have grown alarmingly common. Because for trolls, hiding behind an online profile is easy. The anonymity of social media has made the dissemination of abuse and hate as easy as a simple click. The Listening Post spoke to two journalists, Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Sagarika Ghosh in India, about their experience with online harassment and the impact it's had on their work and their well-being. Also talking us through this story, Hannah Storm, the former director of an organization that trains reporters on how to stay safe both on and off the web.
I used to be a war zone correspondent, but in a war zone, you know where the enemy is. You know what you need to prepare for. You know how to stay safe. In this new landscape, this is intimate. You take it home with you. You wake up with it. It's with you all the time. I've been attacked as a communist operative, a CIA, every kind of word that you can think of for ugly, for animals, for, I don't know, I mean, you name it, it's been thrown at me. As a journalist, I'm used to defending the work I do. But how do you respond when someone threatens you with rape? When someone wants you dead?
And you're inundated with a barrage of hate, of vitriol, words calling you things like prostitute or whore or hooker or somebody else's sex slave, that they're going to do things to you that are really sexually explicit. Women journalists are 3 times more likely to experience online harassment than their male colleagues. People are trying to shame them into silence by calling them names, by undermining their reputation, and by trying to violate their role as journalists.
In August of 2016, Rappler came out with a series of stories. I called it the propaganda machine. That series showed you that social media has been weaponized, that the accounts that are in the middle of this, the content creators, are working for government. And it was all connected to anyone who questioned the drug war. As soon as the series was published, I started receiving an average of 90 hate messages per hour. I'll read one to you. Is that all right? So this one. This is from a real kid. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. So it's not, but it's there. Second one is make sure Maria Ressa gets publicly raped to death when martial law expands to Luzon. It would bring joy in my heart. It's meant to tear you down so that you don't have the confidence to continue reporting. That's one. And then the second is to make you doubt yourself, to stop you from reporting stories that go against the government narrative.
All of that is just a day-to-day rubbish and horror that female journalists have to experience. But it's not just virtual, it's very much physical, it's very much psychological as well. A lot of the journalists who are killed around the world get threats online. So certainly the physical and the virtual do collide. One of the issues for news organisations is trying to understand the severity of the threat, and that's often a difficult issue when you've got an online harassment or got online threats, to figure out how serious do you need to take it.
In the beginning, I never used to take it seriously because I thought it was just, you know, people barking on social media, lunatics on social media, crazy people who I didn't have to take seriously. But then I started getting some very serious threats. One of the first threats that I got was a threat of gang rape. And it was gang rape of me as well as my daughter, who was then in school. And they said, we know where your daughter studies, we know which school she's in, we know what time she comes out of school, and we're going to grab her and we're going to assault her and we're going to perform gang rape. You see, what happens is that the person puts out a threat and then deletes the account. But having deleted the account, lots of other handles then take it up and disseminate it. So its purpose is served because it creates a kind of chilling effect. You get very scared. You tend to sort of self-censor because you're scared of what is out there.
The IWMF Trollbusters report said that something like 30% of female journalists they spoke with had considered leaving the profession because of the impact it had had on them. Something like 40% of female journalists have actually stopped writing about certain stories. If we're in a situation where journalists are impacted onto this extent, that's really, really damaging to freedom of expression as well.
The threats kept on growing and they kept getting more and more abusive and more foul. If you're a liberal, you're under attack. If you're a journalist, you're under attack. If you're a liberal woman journalist, you're public enemy number one. There are women who are attacked on social media who are then attacked off social media. The threats can be online and then go offline. My colleague and good friend Gauri Lankesh was actually shot in September 2017, and a Facebook user put out a hit list of me and 4 other women saying that, well, one has been taken care of, we now need to locate these 5 other women, find out where they live, and we need to systematically finish them off. And this was then shared by numerous other Facebook users. Now, the reason why I take these Facebook and Twitter threats seriously is because, you know, this is exactly what happened to Lankesh. She faced social media threats and she never used to take it seriously. But the fact is she was killed. You know, and the scary thing about Gauri's death was that the murder suspect has said that, oh, I didn't know who she was. I was just told that she was damaging my religion, and so I killed her. So that's the level of brainwashing and fanaticism that exists out there. I don't think the government is doing anything about it, actually. I think a number of these trolls who are there on social media are actually followed by government ministers. I think social media companies need to do much more. I would love it if people were engaging with me on my journalism, or who were engaging with me on my work. But if it becomes a place for death threats and for rape threats and for gang rape threats, then I think it loses its meaning. Social media companies need to have much stricter restrictions on what is hate speech, what is hate speech against women, what is hate speech against minorities.
The problem that I've seen is that they are in Silicon Valley, looking at the world through lenses that don't take into account the global landscape they operate in. When I hear Mark Zuckerberg say, you know, it'll take us 5 years, I just say, you know, we don't have 5 years in our countries where people are getting killed every day. In the Philippines, information is the core of our beliefs, of our common reality. And we need to get back to a point where this kind of dystopian use of information is mitigated.
Finally, India. Even when you take the country's population into account, it's the busiest, most crowded television market in the world. It has more than 900 privately owned channels. More than 400 of those are news channels, the 24-hour kind. They've just covered a national election in which the voting, not the campaigning, the voting took 5 weeks. Imagine how much news content was churned out. The reality is that Prime Minister Narendra Modi just won a second term in office, but we're going to look at the virtual reality and some of the other tricks and gimmicks that those news channels used to try to get viewers who vote with their remotes to tune in. Some of those channels went slightly over the top. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
And right above, Bharatvarsh. ये लीजिए, ये आ गया quadcopter.
कि गठबंधन का जादू इन एग्जिट पोल के मुताबिक फिलहाल वहां नहीं चल रहा है.
Stay with the headline right now.
Closing the doors now. All set. I'm in place. And quadcopter up and away. Let's go. चलते हैं. थोड़ा सा इनका टेक ऑफ में तकलीफ होती है, but now we are set. And the drones follow me out of the studio.
You're giving 23. 26. It could be 18. It could be 19.
He's saying 287. He's saying 305.
It could be 20 also.
In 306, 262 is to the BJP.
Yeah. Okay, well, 70, sir.
70,
you are being
70.
The night sky is fantastic.
And what is happening in Karnataka? Remember, this is a crucial state for the BJP.
340 anta helidru.
3 to 6 for the Congress-JDS alliance.
This seems to be a spot of bother.
If I can quickly take a view.
Narendra Modi is coming back in 2019.
And let's head back to the studio.